The gunshot that killed her husband still echoed in Beatrice Lawson's nightmares. Even though 3 years had passed since that terrible day in Kansas City, when a robbery gone wrong had taken everything from her, except the baby growing in her womb. She stood at the edge of Georgetown, Colorado in the spring of 1878, clutching her carpet bag with one hand and holding tight to her 3-year-old son Thomas with the other, wondering if running this far west had been madness or salvation. The mountain town sprawled before her like a promise she was afraid to believe in. Silver mines dotted the surrounding peaks, and the main street bustled with miners, merchants, and the occasional cowboy driving cattle through to higher pastures. The air was thinner here than she was used to, and the Rocky Mountains rose up on all sides like the walls of a fortress. Maybe here, finally, she could stop running from the memories. Maybe here, no one would ask too many questions about a widow with a young son and no family to speak of. Thomas tugged at her worn calico skirt. "Mama, I am hungry." Beatrice looked down at her son's upturned face, those wide blue eyes that reminded her so much of Michael, and felt her heart constrict with love and fear in equal measure. She had exactly $12 to her name, the last of what she had managed to save from 3 years of taking and washing and mending in Denver. It had to last until she found work, and Georgetown was her last hope. Denver had grown too expensive, too crowded, and too many people had started asking questions she did not want to answer. "I know, sweetheart. We will find someplace to eat soon, I promise." She straightened her bonnet and tried to smooth the worst wrinkles from her traveling dress. First impressions mattered, especially for a woman alone. The general store seemed like the best place to start. In Beatrice's experience, storekeepers knew everything about a town and everyone in it. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the scent of coffee, leather, and dried tobacco greeted her. A portly man with mutton chops looked up from behind the counter. "Help you, Mrs. Lawson," Beatrice corrected gently. "I have just arrived in Georgetown, and I am looking for work and lodging. I am a skilled seamstress and laundress, and I can cook and clean as well." The storekeeper's expression softened slightly as he looked at Thomas, who was staring wide-eyed at the jars of penny candy on the lower shelves. "Work for women is not easy to come by here. This is a mining town, mostly men, but Mrs. Henderson, who runs the boarding house on Silver Street, is always needing help. She is getting on in years, and the work is too much for her alone. Cannot promise anything, but she might take you on." Relief flooded through Beatrice. "Thank you, sir. That is very kind. Silver Street is 2 blocks north, white house with green shutters. You cannot miss it." He reached into one of the candy jars and pulled out a peppermint stick. "For the little one. Looks like he has had a long journey." Beatrice's eyes stung with unexpected tears at the small kindness. "Thank you. That is very generous." Thomas's face lit up as she handed him the candy, and for a moment the worry eased from her shoulders. People could be kind. She had to remember that. Not everyone was out to hurt her or judge her for the choices she had made to survive. The boarding house was exactly where the storekeeper had said, a 2-story frame building that had seen better days but was clean and well-maintained. Beatrice knocked on the door, her heart hammering. Thomas had sticky peppermint residue around his mouth, and she quickly wiped it away with her handkerchief before the door opened. The woman who answered was perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "If you are looking for a room, I am full up. Mining season." "Actually, I am looking for work. The gentleman at the general store suggested you might need help. I am a hard worker, Mrs. Henderson, and I am skilled with a needle and at keeping house. I would work for room and board for myself and my son, plus whatever wages you think fair." Mrs. Henderson's gaze moved from Beatrice to Thomas and back again. Something in her expression shifted, though Beatrice could not read what it was. "You are running from something." It was not a question. Beatrice met her eyes steadily. "I am running toward something better for my son. My husband died 3 years ago. I have no family, no one to turn to, but I am respectable and I am willing to work harder than anyone you could hire." A long moment passed. Then Mrs. Henderson stepped back and opened the door wider. "I have 8 boarders, all minors. They need breakfast before dawn and supper when they come back. Laundry twice a week, rooms cleaned, linens changed. It is hard work, and I will not tolerate any funny business with the men." "There will not be any, madam. You have my word." "Then I suppose we can try it for a week and see how we get on. You and your boy can have the small room off the kitchen. It is not much, but it is clean and warm. Meals included, and I will pay you $2 a week if you work out." $2 a week plus room and board. It was not much, but it was more than Beatrice had dared hope for. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. You will not regret this, I promise." "We will see about that. Come on, then. I will show you where you will be staying, and then you can help me get supper on. The men will be back in 2 hours, and they eat like horses." The room was indeed small, barely large enough for the narrow bed and a washstand, but it had a window that looked out on the mountains, and the bed had a real mattress and clean quilts. After sleeping on a thin pallet in a shared room in Denver, it felt like luxury. Thomas immediately climbed onto the bed and bounced, his face breaking into the first real smile Beatrice had seen in days. "Mama, is this ours? Do we really get to stay here?" "If we work hard and mind our manners, yes." She sat beside him and pulled him close, breathing in the little boy scent of him. "We are going to be all right, Thomas. I promise you, everything is going to be all right." She wanted desperately to believe her own words. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of backbreaking work. Beatrice rose before dawn to help Mrs. Henderson prepare breakfast for 8 hungry miners. She learned their names and preferences, who liked their eggs scrambled and who wanted them fried, who took sugar in their coffee and who drank it black. She washed mountains of laundry, scrubbed floors until her knees ached, and mended clothes by candlelight after Thomas had fallen asleep. But the work was honest, and Mrs. Henderson, though strict, was fair. Thomas thrived on regular meals and the attention of the miners, who treated him like a mascot and taught him to whittle and identify different minerals. For the first time since Michael's death, Beatrice began to feel something like hope taking root in her chest. It was a Saturday afternoon in late May when everything changed. Beatrice was in the front yard, hanging sheets on the clothesline while Thomas played with a wooden horse one of the miners had carved for him. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up, and she saw a rider approaching on a magnificent bay gelding. Even from a distance, there was something about the way he sat his horse that spoke of easy confidence and long hours in the saddle. As he drew closer, Beatrice could see he was younger than most of the miners, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark hair that needed cutting, and several days' worth of stubble on his strong jaw. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, trail dusty and well-worn, with a Colt revolver holstered at his hip and a rifle in a saddle scabbard. He touched his hat brim as he rode past, and his eyes met hers for just a moment. They were a startling gray-green, the color of sage after rain. Something in Beatrice's stomach fluttered strangely, and she looked away quickly, focusing intently on the sheet she was pinning to the line. She heard him dismount near the front porch and knock on the door. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried through the open windows. "James Northwood." "It has been 6 months. I was starting to think you had gotten yourself killed." "Not yet, Mrs. Henderson, though it has not been for lack of trying." His voice was deep and warm with a hint of humor in it. "Do you have a room available? I am in town for a few weeks, and I would rather stay here than at the hotel if you have space." "For you, I will make space. Are you working for the Cattlemen's Association again?" "Yes, madam. They are having trouble with rustlers up in the high meadows. I am supposed to scout out the situation and report back." Beatrice tried not to listen, but the conversation was impossible to ignore. She had heard of the Cattlemen's Association, which hired range detectives to protect the large herds that grazed the mountain meadows in summer. It was dangerous work, the kind that attracted men who were either brave or foolish or some combination of both. Thomas had abandoned his toy horse and was staring at the real one with undisguised fascination. "Mama, look at the horse. He is so big." The cowboy, James Northwood, appeared around the corner of the house, presumably heading to the stable out back to tend to his mount. He stopped when he saw Thomas, and a smile transformed his weather-beaten face. "You like horses, son?" Thomas nodded vigorously. "I have never been close to one before." "Well, we cannot have that, can we?" James glanced at Beatrice, a question in his eyes. "Would it be all right if I let him pet Storm here? He is gentle as a lamb despite his size." Beatrice wanted to say no, wanted to keep Thomas close and safe, but the hope shining in her son's eyes was impossible to deny. "If you are certain the horse will not spook. Storm has been around children before. He will be fine." James led the bay closer and showed Thomas how to hold out his hand flat so the horse could sniff him. "There you go. See, he likes you." Thomas's delighted laugh as the horse's soft nose explored his palm made Beatrice's throat tighten. Michael should have been here to teach their son about horses and all the other things boys needed to know. But Michael was gone, and she was doing the best she could alone. "What is your name, son?" James asked. "Thomas Lawson. I am 3 years old." Thomas held up 3 fingers proudly. 3 years old. That is a fine age. James's gaze shifted to Beatrice, and she felt suddenly self-conscious about her rolled-up sleeves and the damp tendrils of hair that had escaped her bun. "I am James Northwood, madam. I take it you are Mrs. Henderson's new help, Beatrice Lawson." "Yes, I have been here about 2 weeks now." "Well, Mrs. Lawson, it is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, and yours too, Thomas." He touched his hat brim again. "I should get Storm settled before Mrs. Henderson comes looking for me. She runs a tight ship." As he led the horse away, Beatrice found herself watching the easy swing of his stride and the gentle way he handled the animal. She shook her head sharply. The last thing she needed was to develop some foolish infatuation with a man who lived by his gun and probably never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots. She had Thomas to think about, and their fragile new stability was not worth risking for anything. But over the next few days, she found it increasingly difficult to ignore James Northwood. He was polite to everyone, helpful without being asked, and unfailingly kind to Thomas, who had developed a serious case of hero worship. James taught him to tie knots, showed him how to identify animal tracks, and carved him a better horse to replace the crude one the miner had made. Beatrice tried to maintain a proper distance, but Georgetown was a small town, and the boarding house was smaller still. She could not help noticing things about James. The way he always offered to carry heavy water buckets for Mrs. Henderson. The quiet respect he showed the older woman. The fact that, unlike some of the miners, he never looked at Beatrice with anything but courtesy in his eyes. It was nearly a week after his arrival when Beatrice came downstairs early one morning to find James already in the kitchen, trying to coax the temperamental stove to life. "You are up early," she said, startled. He looked up and grinned ruefully. "Habit. I have been waking before dawn since I was 12 years old. Figured I would make myself useful, but I think this stove has it in for me." Beatrice set down her basket of mending and moved to the stove. "It has a trick to it. You have to adjust the damper just so, or it will not draw properly." She demonstrated, and within moments, the fire was crackling merrily. "You have a gift," James said admiringly. "I would have been here another hour cursing at it. Just practice. I have been fighting with temperamental stoves for years." She filled the coffee pot with water and set it on to boil. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Northwood, James, please? And yes, madam, though I cannot promise I will have a good answer. Why did you become a range detective? It seems like dangerous work for uncertain pay." He was quiet for a moment, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. In the dim pre-dawn light, his face was all plains and shadows. "My father had a small ranch down near Colorado Springs. When I was 19, rustlers hit us hard, took most of our breeding stock. My father tried to track them down himself, and they killed him for his trouble. Left my mother and sisters with nothing. I sold what was left of the ranch to pay the debts and make sure they were taken care of, and then I went looking for the men who did it." "Did you find them?" Beatrice asked softly. "Eventually. 2 of them were hanged. One I tracked all the way to New Mexico before the law caught up with him." His expression was distant. "After that, the Cattlemen's Association heard about me and offered me work. Figured if I was going to be hunting thieves anyway, might as well get paid for it. And maybe I could stop what happened to my family from happening to someone else." Beatrice understood the need for justice, but she also understood the cost of violence. "Do you ever think about doing something else? Something safer?" "All the time," James admitted. "But I am good at this work, and it pays well enough that I have been able to help my mother and sisters. My youngest sister, Lily, just got married to a good man. My other sister, Mary, is teaching school in Colorado Springs. My mother lives with Mary and helps with her children. Knowing they are safe and provided for makes the danger worthwhile." The coffee pot began to boil, and Beatrice busied herself with measuring grounds. "That is very noble of you." "Not noble, just doing what needs to be done." He paused. "Can I ask you something now, Beatrice?" "It is Beatrice, is it not? Or would you prefer Mrs. Lawson?" Her name in his voice sent a little shiver down her spine that she tried to ignore. "Beatrice is fine." "Where is Thomas's father, if that is not too personal a question?" The familiar grief squeezed her chest, but it was duller now than it had been, like an old bruise instead of a fresh wound. "He died 3 years ago before Thomas was born. There was a robbery at the store where he worked in Kansas City. He tried to stop them and they shot him. I am sorry." "That is a hard thing." "Yes." She poured the boiling water over the grounds and replaced the lid. "But we are managing. Thomas is healthy and happy, and that is what matters." Mrs. Henderson's footsteps creaked on the stairs above them, and James straightened. "I should probably make myself scarce before she sees me lurking in her kitchen. Thank you for the coffee, Beatrice, and for the conversation." After he left, Beatrice stood alone in the warming kitchen and tried to sort through the tangle of feelings in her chest. She had not talked to a man, really talked, since Michael died. Most men either ignored her as beneath their notice or looked at her in ways that made her skin crawl. James did neither. He spoke to her like she was a person worth knowing, and that was somehow more dangerous than anything else. The weeks slipped by, spring turning toward summer. James spent his days riding into the high country, tracking the rustlers and gathering information for the Cattlemen's Association. He was often gone for days at a time, and Beatrice told herself she did not notice his absences or feel relieved when he returned safely. She was lying to herself, and she knew it. Thomas certainly was not lying. He lived for the evenings when James would come back to the boarding house and tell stories of what he had seen in the mountains. James had a gift for storytelling. making even mundane events sound like adventures, and he always included details he knew would capture a child's imagination. The other miners tolerated Thomas's presence, but James actively sought it out, and Beatrice could see her son blossoming under the attention. It terrified her. What would happen when James's job was finished and he moved on? Thomas would be heartbroken. And if she was being honest with herself, she would be too. It was a warm evening in mid-June when everything came to a head. Mrs. Henderson had gone to visit a friend for the night, leaving Beatrice in charge of the boarding house. Most of the miners were playing cards in the common room, and Thomas was already asleep upstairs. Beatrice was in the kitchen, elbow deep in dishwater, when James appeared in the doorway. "Need some help?" he offered. "I've got it, thank you." She scrubbed at a stubborn pot, not looking at him. "Beatrice, have I done something to offend you?" That made her look up. "What? No, of course not. Then why have you been avoiding me for the past week?" He moved into the kitchen, his boots loud on the wooden floor. "Every time I come into a room, you find an excuse to leave. You barely look at me at meals. If I have overstepped in some way, I apologize." Beatrice set down the pot and dried her hands on her apron, buying time to collect her thoughts. "You have not overstepped. You have been nothing but kind and respectful. That is actually the problem." James frowned. "I am not sure I follow." The words came out in a rush. "Thomas adores you. He talks about you constantly. What you said, what you did, what you taught him. And that is wonderful, truly it is, but what happens when you leave? You are going to break his heart, and I do not know how to protect him from that." Understanding dawned in James's eyes. "I see. Do you? He has already lost his father. I cannot let him get attached to another man who is just going to disappear from his life." Her voice shook slightly. "It is not fair to him." James stepped closer. "And what about you, Beatrice? Are you afraid I am going to break your heart too?" The question hung in the air between them. Beatrice wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but she found she could not lie. "I cannot afford to think about my heart. I have to think about my son." "What if I told you I have been thinking about staying in Georgetown?" James said quietly. "The Cattlemen's Association has offered me a permanent position based here, overseeing security for all the ranches in the area. It would mean less traveling, a steady salary, a real home instead of boarding houses and trail camps." Beatrice's heart stuttered. "Why would you even consider that? You have always moved around." "Because in the past few weeks, I have started to imagine a different kind of life, one with roots, one with a family." He took another step closer, and Beatrice could smell leather and sage and something that was purely him. "One with you and Thomas in it, if you would ever consider such a thing." "James, you barely know me." But her protest was weak, and they both knew it. "I know you are strong and capable and loving. I know you would do anything for your son. I know you make terrible coffee but can coax a stubborn stove into behaving like it was trained. I know the way you smile when Thomas laughs lights up your whole face. I know I think about you every minute I am in those mountains, and coming back here is the best part of my day." His hand came up, gentle fingers tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I know I am falling in love with you, and I am pretty sure I have been since the day I saw you hanging laundry in Mrs. Henderson's yard." Beatrice could not breathe. No one had spoken to her like this since Michael, and even Michael had never been quite so direct or eloquent. "I have a son from before," she whispered, afraid. It was the thing she always came back to, the reason she had never let herself imagine a future with any man. "Thomas came first. He always had to come first." James's answer was immediate and sure. "Then I have a son too now." The tears came then, hot and fast, spilling down her cheeks. James pulled her into his arms, and she let herself lean into his strength, let herself believe for the first time that maybe she did not have to carry everything alone. His heart beat steady and strong under her ear, and his arms around her felt like safety, like home, like everything she had thought she would never have again. "I am scared," she admitted into his shirt. "So am I. But I think we can be scared together if you are willing to try." Beatrice pulled back just enough to look up at him. In the lamplight, his eyes were soft and warm, and she saw her own hope reflected there. "Thomas has to come first, always. I would not want it any other way. He is a fine boy, Beatrice. You have done an amazing job raising him. But you do not have to do it alone anymore, if you do not want to." She rose on her toes and kissed him, a brief, soft press of lips that held promise and possibility. James made a low sound in his throat and cupped her face in his calloused hands, deepening the kiss into something that made her knees weak and her heart race. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "Is that a yes?" James asked, a little unsteadily. "That is a maybe," Beatrice said, but she was smiling. "Court me properly, James Northwood. Take me on walks and bring me flowers, and let Thomas see that you mean to stick around. If you are still here in 3 months, ask me again." 3 months, James agreed. "I can do that." He kept his word. Over the next few weeks, James formally accepted the permanent position with the Cattlemen's Association and found a small house to rent on the edge of Georgetown. He courted Beatrice with old-fashioned determination, bringing her wildflowers from the mountain meadows and carving her a beautiful wooden box to keep her sewing supplies in. He took both her and Thomas on picnics by the creek, teaching the boy to fish and skip stones. Mrs. Henderson watched it all with approval, and the miners at the boarding house began placing bets on when James would propose. Beatrice pretended not to notice, but inside she was glowing with a happiness she had thought lost forever. It was not all smooth sailing. There were moments when Beatrice's fear would surge up, and she would pull back, putting distance between herself and James. There were nights when nightmares of Michael's death would wake her, and she would lie in the dark wondering if she was betraying his memory by loving another man. And there was always the worry about Thomas, about whether she was doing the right thing, but James was patient. When she pulled back, he gave her space but never disappeared. When her fear showed, he met it with quiet reassurance and steady presence. And with Thomas, he was perfect, taking on the role of teacher and friend without ever trying to replace the father Thomas had never known. One evening in early August, James arrived at the boarding house with a serious expression. Beatrice's heart sank. This was it. He was going to tell her he had been offered a job somewhere else, that he was moving on, that she had been a fool to believe in promises. But instead he asked, "Can we talk? Just the two of us?" Mrs. Henderson shooed them out to the front porch, taking Thomas to the kitchen for cookies and milk. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Beatrice sat on the porch swing, and James settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I have been thinking," he began. "That sounds dangerous," Beatrice tried to joke, but her voice was tight. James took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "It has been almost 3 months since I asked you to give me a chance. And I need to know, Beatrice, is there a future for us? Because I am all in. I love you. I love Thomas. I want to build a life with both of you. But I need to know if you feel the same way or if I am just fooling myself." Beatrice looked at their joined hands, his tanned and scarred, hers roughened from work. She thought about the past 3 months, about watching James with Thomas, teaching him to ride and whittle and be brave. She thought about the way James looked at her, like she was something precious and strong all at once. She thought about going to sleep thinking of him and waking with him as her first thought. "I love you," she said quietly. "I did not want to. I tried not to, but I do. And Thomas loves you too. He asked me the other day when you were going to come live with us." James let out a breath that sounded suspiciously shaky. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that was up to you." She turned to face him fully. "I am not the same woman I was when Michael was alive. I have been through things that changed me. I am harder now, more cautious. And I come with a child and responsibilities and no dowry to speak of. But if you still want me, if you still want us, then yes. Yes to all of it." James pulled her close and kissed her with a thoroughness that left no doubt about his feelings. When he finally released her, he was grinning. "Marry me, Beatrice Lawson. Make me the happiest man in Colorado. Let me be Thomas's father and your husband and everything else we can be together." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, yes, yes." The kiss that followed was interrupted by a whoop of joy from inside the house, and they broke apart to find Mrs. Henderson and all 8 miners crowded at the window, watching them unabashedly. Thomas pushed his way to the front, his face alight with excitement. "Are you going to be my papa?" he shouted. James crossed to the door and swept Thomas up into his arms. "If that is all right with you, I would be honored to be your papa." Thomas threw his arms around James's neck and squeezed tight. "I have wanted a papa forever and ever." Beatrice watched them together, her two loves, and felt something inside her that had been clenched tight for 3 long years finally relax. She was not betraying Michael by moving forward. She was honoring him by making sure their son had the life Michael would have wanted for him, full of love and security and joy. They were married in late September in the small church at the center of Georgetown. Mrs. Henderson stood up with Beatrice, and one of the miners, a gruff man named Sullivan, stood up with James. Thomas was there too, wearing a new suit that James had bought for him and carrying the rings tied to a small pillow. Beatrice wore a simple dress of pale blue calico that she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs that Mrs. Henderson had contributed from her own carefully hoarded supplies. She carried wildflowers that James and Thomas had picked together that morning from the mountain meadows. As she walked down the short aisle to where James waited, tall and handsome in his best clothes with his hair finally trimmed and his jaw freshly shaved, Beatrice felt like she was walking into her future instead of away from her past. James's eyes shone as he took her hand, and the minister's words washed over them like a blessing. "Do you, James Northwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," James said firmly, his gaze never leaving Beatrice's face. "And do you, Beatrice Lawson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Beatrice whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." James cupped her face in his hands, tender and reverent, and kissed her softly. The small congregation erupted in applause and cheers, and Thomas tugged at James's coat. "Can I have a kiss too?" James laughed and bent down, kissing Thomas's forehead. "You bet, son, son." The word settled over Thomas like a mantle, and his smile was brighter than the sun. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a feast, and the whole town seemed to turn out to wish them well. Even the Presbyterian minister's wife, who was known for being particular about who she associated with, told Beatrice that she had made a fine match and that James Northwood was a good man. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to drift away, James pulled Beatrice aside. "Are you happy?" "Happier than I ever thought I would be again," she admitted. "Thank you for being patient with me, for waiting until I was ready." "You are worth waiting for," James said simply. You and Thomas both. I meant what I said, Beatrice. I am in this for the long haul. Forever. Forever. It was a big word, a frightening word, but with James's hand in hers and Thomas sleeping peacefully in Mrs. Henderson's care for the night, Beatrice found she believed it. They moved into James's rented house the next day. It was not much, just 3 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs. Thomas was beside himself with excitement over having his own small bedroom, and Beatrice spent the first week arranging and rearranging their meager possessions, trying to make the house feel like a home. James continued his work with the Cattlemen's Association, but true to his word, he was home most nights. The work was still dangerous at times, but knowing he was coming back to them made it bearable. And slowly, day by day, Beatrice began to relax into this new life. Thomas flourished. He had a father now, someone to teach him and guide him and love him. James was patient and firm in equal measure, setting boundaries while also encouraging Thomas's natural curiosity and adventurous spirit. Watching them together, teaching Thomas to ride the old mare James had purchased or working side by side in the small garden behind the house, made Beatrice's heart full to bursting. The first winter was hard. Snow came early to the mountains, and Georgetown was often isolated for days at a time. Money was tight, and there were weeks when Beatrice had to stretch their supplies and get creative with meals. But they were together, and that made all the difference. James would come home from long days checking on cattle and ranches, his face red from the cold, and Thomas would run to greet him like he had been gone for months instead of hours. Beatrice would have hot coffee waiting and whatever simple meal she had managed to put together, and the 3 of them would sit around the small table in their warm kitchen and talk about their days. These were the moments Beatrice treasured most. Not the big events or special occasions, but the ordinary rhythms of daily life with the people she loved. Thomas's chatter about the snow fort he was building, James's stories about the ranchers he had visited, the comfortable silence as they all worked on evening tasks, together in the same room. It was in late January, during a particularly brutal cold snap, that Beatrice realized she was pregnant. The realization came with a complex mix of emotions. Joy, certainly, at the thought of giving James a child of his own blood, but also fear about money, and whether they could afford another mouth to feed. And underneath it all, a strange, guilty feeling, as if having James's baby somehow diminished what she had shared with Michael. She did not tell James immediately. She needed time to sort through her feelings, to come to terms with this new development. But James knew her too well, and after a few days of watching her pick at her food and stare off into space, he confronted her. "What is wrong?" he asked one evening after Thomas had gone to bed. "And do not tell me nothing, because I know you better than that." Beatrice set down the sock she had been darning and looked at her husband. He was stretched out in the chair by the fire, his long legs extended toward the warmth, watching her with concern in his eyes. She loved him so much it hurt sometimes. "I am pregnant," she said quietly. James sat up straight, joy spreading across his face. "Beatrice, that is wonderful. Why did you not tell me sooner?" Then he saw her expression and his smile faded. "Unless you do not think it is wonderful, no, I do. I am happy. Truly I am." She twisted the sock in her hands. "But I am also scared. About money, about whether Thomas will be jealous, about whether I can manage 2 children when I barely managed with 1. And I feel guilty, which is ridiculous, but I cannot help it." James moved to sit beside her on the sofa, pulling her into his arms. "Guilty about what? Michael and I always planned to have more children, but he died before that could happen. And now I am having another baby, but not with him. It feels like I am erasing him somehow, or replacing what we had." "Listen to me," James said firmly. tilting her face up so she had to meet his eyes. "You are not erasing Michael or replacing him. Thomas is Michael's son, and nothing will ever change that. I would never want it to. But this baby, our baby, that does not diminish what you had with Michael. It is just a new chapter, Beatrice. A different love, not a replacement. But what if I cannot love this baby as much as I love Thomas? What if Thomas feels like I am choosing the new baby over him? You have the biggest heart of anyone I know. You will love this baby just as fiercely as you love Thomas, in the same way and differently all at once. That is what parents do." James placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "And Thomas is going to be an amazing big brother. Have you seen how gentle he is with the barn cats? He will adore this baby." Tears spilled down Beatrice's cheeks. "What about money? We are barely getting by as it is. I have been saving, not much but enough to see us through, and I have been talking to the association about taking on more responsibility, which would mean a raise." "We will manage, Beatrice. We always do." He kissed her softly. "I love you, and I am so happy about this baby. We are going to be fine." His confidence was infectious. Beatrice let herself lean into it, let herself believe that maybe everything would work out after all. They told Thomas a few days later. His reaction was everything James had predicted and more. He was thrilled at the idea of being a big brother and immediately began planning all the things he would teach the baby. "Can we name him after Papa James?" Thomas asked eagerly. "If it is a boy." Beatrice and James exchanged glances. "We will think about it," James said diplomatically. "We have a while yet before the baby comes, but it is very kind of you to suggest that, Thomas." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Beatrice was sick in the mornings for the first few months, but otherwise, she felt well. The townspeople were universally happy for them, and Mrs. Henderson knitted a beautiful blanket as a gift. The miners from the boarding house took up a collection and presented them with a handmade cradle that one of them, a skilled carpenter, had crafted. Spring came to Georgetown in a rush of snowmelt and budding trees. Thomas turned 4 and celebrated with a small party that James organized, complete with a cake that Beatrice made and games that left all the children who attended sticky and exhausted. As Beatrice's belly swelled with new life, she found herself marveling at how different this pregnancy was from her first. When she had been pregnant with Thomas, she had been consumed with grief and fear, uncertain about her future and terrified of raising a child alone. Now, she was surrounded by love and support. James doted on her shamelessly, taking on more of the household tasks and insisting she rest. Thomas tried to be helpful, bringing her water and reading her his favorite stories. It was in late August, when the mountains were ablaze with wildflowers, and the air was sweet with summer, that Beatrice went into labor. James had been out checking on a ranch, but had made sure to stay close to home as her due date approached. When the first pains came, Beatrice sent Thomas to fetch Mrs. Henderson, who had agreed to help with the birth. The older woman arrived quickly, took one look at Beatrice, and began issuing calm, competent instructions. James appeared an hour later, his face pale with worry. "How is she?" "She is doing fine," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "But you need to take Thomas out of here. This is no place for a child." James nodded and scooped up Thomas, who was watching the proceedings with wide, frightened eyes. "Come on, son. Let us go see if we can catch some fish for supper, shall we?" "But what about Mama?" "Mama is going to be just fine. Mrs. Henderson is taking good care of her, and when we get back you will have a baby brother or sister to meet." James paused at the bedroom door, his eyes finding Beatrice's. "I love you. You can do this." "I love you too," Beatrice managed between contractions. The labor was long and difficult, longer than Thomas's had been. As the hours stretched on and the pain intensified, Beatrice found herself thinking about Michael, about the night Thomas was born when she had been alone except for a disinterested midwife in a charity ward. How different this was with Mrs. Henderson's kind hands and encouraging words, with the knowledge that James was nearby and would be back as soon as he could. It was well into the night when the baby finally arrived, tiny and red-faced and squalling with indignation at being forced into the world. Mrs. Henderson cleaned the infant efficiently and placed the bundle in Beatrice's arms. "You have a son," the older woman said, smiling. "A healthy, strong boy." Beatrice looked down at her new son and felt a wave of love so intense it took her breath away. He had James's strong chin and a surprising amount of dark hair. His little fists waved in the air, and when she touched his palm, his tiny fingers wrapped around hers with surprising strength. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world, Mrs. Henderson went to fetch James and Thomas. They appeared moments later, Thomas hanging back shyly while James approached the bed as if he was walking on sacred ground. "Is it really my brother?" Thomas asked in a hushed voice. "It really is," Beatrice confirmed. "Come meet him, Thomas." Thomas climbed onto the bed carefully, his eyes huge as he looked at the baby. "He is so small. Is he going to get bigger?" "He will get bigger every day," James said, ruffling Thomas's hair. Then he looked at Beatrice and there were tears in his eyes. "Are you all right? Tired, but yes. Come meet your son." James sat on the edge of the bed, and Beatrice carefully transferred the baby into his arms. Watching her husband hold their child for the first time, his face full of wonder and love, Beatrice felt something settle deep in her soul. This was her family. Not a replacement for what she had lost, but something new and precious and entirely its own. "What should we name him?" James asked softly. They had discussed names, but nothing had felt quite right. Beatrice looked at Thomas, who was gently touching the baby's tiny hand, and then at James, who was staring at their son like he had discovered treasure. "Michael," she said quietly. "Michael James Northwood." James looked up sharply. "Are you sure?" "I do not want you to feel you have to, I am sure. Thomas's father deserves to be remembered and honored, and this way both our sons will carry the names of good men." She reached out and took James's free hand. "Is that all right with you?" "More than all right. It is perfect." James leaned over and kissed her forehead. "You are amazing, Beatrice Northwood. Absolutely amazing." Thomas, who had been listening carefully, spoke up. "So his whole name is Michael James Northwood." "That is right," Beatrice confirmed. "That is a very big name for such a tiny baby," Thomas said seriously. "Can we call him Mikey?" James laughed. "I think Mikey is a fine nickname. What do you think, little man? Do you like being called Mikey?" The baby made a small snuffling sound, and they all took it as agreement. The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, but Beatrice had never been happier. Thomas took his role as big brother seriously, always wanting to help with Mikey. He would fetch diapers and sing to the baby when he cried and proudly tell anyone who would listen that this was his brother. James was a devoted father, getting up in the night to change Mikey and walking him around the house when he was fussy. Watching him with their children, Beatrice sometimes had to pinch herself to believe this was her life now. The following spring, when Mikey was 8 months old and pulling himself up on furniture, James came home with news. "The Cattlemen's Association has offered me a promotion. I would be the chief range detective for the entire region, overseeing all the other detectives. It comes with a substantial raise." "James, that is wonderful," Beatrice exclaimed. Then she saw his expression. "What is the catch?" "It would mean less field work but more travel. I would have to visit the various ranches regularly, check in with the men under my supervision. I would probably be gone 2 or 3 nights a week instead of coming home every evening." Beatrice's heart sank, but she tried to be practical. "What do you want to do?" "I want to say yes. The money would mean we could buy our own house instead of renting, maybe even save enough to buy a small ranch of our own someday. But not if it means sacrificing our family. You and the boys come first, Beatrice. Always." She thought about it carefully. They had been scraping by, making ends meet but with no cushion for emergencies or unexpected expenses. The additional income would give them security, a future. And James would still be home most nights. "I think you should take it," she said finally. "We will manage the nights you are gone. And the benefits outweigh the costs." James pulled her into his arms. "Are you sure?" "I am sure. We are strong, James. We can handle a few nights apart." He accepted the position and they settled into a new routine. James was gone more, but when he was home, he made the most of every moment. And true to his word, within 2 years, they had saved enough to put a down payment on a small ranch just outside Georgetown. It was not much, just 40 acres with a run-down house and a barn that needed significant repairs. But it was theirs. James threw himself into fixing up the property, and Beatrice worked alongside him when she could, painting walls and mending fences while Thomas and Mikey played nearby. Thomas was 7 now, tall for his age and already showing signs of the man he would become. He helped James with the ranch work, learning to care for the small herd of cattle they had started and the chickens Beatrice kept for eggs. Mikey was 3, a whirlwind of energy and mischief who kept Beatrice constantly on her toes. It was a good life, a happy life, but there were challenges too. Money was always tight. The cattle market was unpredictable, and there were years when they barely broke even. James's work, though less dangerous than it had been, still carried risks. There was the winter he was caught in a blizzard and did not make it home for 5 days, leaving Beatrice terrified that she had lost him. But they weathered every storm together. And through it all, their love deepened and matured into something solid and unshakable. When Beatrice was 32, she became pregnant again. It was unexpected, and she worried about being able to manage 3 children and the ranch work. But James was thrilled, and the boys were excited about another sibling. This time, the baby was a girl. They named her Grace, and she had Beatrice's blonde hair and James's gray-green eyes. Thomas and Mikey were incredibly gentle with their baby sister, competing to see who could make her laugh. As Grace grew from infant to toddler to little girl, the ranch slowly prospered. James's skill and reputation meant steady work, and their herd expanded. They added pigs and more chickens, and Beatrice started selling eggs and butter in town. It was hard work, but it was theirs, and they were building something lasting. Thomas, at 15, was already taller than Beatrice and rapidly catching up to James. He had his father Michael's gentle nature and James's steady competence. He talked about maybe becoming a rancher himself someday, or possibly a veterinarian, as he had a gift with animals. Mikey was 11, full of energy and laughter. He was the most social of their children, making friends easily and always organizing games and adventures with the other children from nearby ranches. Grace was 7, a serious child who loved books and learning. James had taught her to read when she was 4, and she devoured every book she could get her hands on. It was a warm summer evening, and the family was gathered on the porch of their house, which James had expanded over the years to include 4 bedrooms and a proper parlor. Thomas was reading aloud from a newspaper while Mikey and Grace played checkers. James sat in his rocking chair, whittling a toy horse for one of their neighbor's children. Beatrice was mending, her needle flashing in the fading light. "Mama, tell us the story of how you and Papa met," Grace requested, not for the first time. Beatrice smiled. This was her daughter's favorite story, and she never tired of hearing it. Well, I was hanging laundry at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, and your papa rode up on Storm, looking very handsome and very dusty from the trail. And I saw the most beautiful woman I had ever laid eyes on, James interjected, winking at Beatrice. You did not even notice me, Beatrice protested, laughing. You were too busy talking to Mrs. Henderson about getting a room. I noticed you. I just tried to play it cool. James set down his whittling. But then I met Thomas here, and he was so excited about Storm that I knew I had to get to know his mother. Thomas, who had heard this story countless times, still smiled. He knew about his birth father and the tragedy that had brought Beatrice to Georgetown. James had made sure Thomas understood that Michael Lawson was his father and always would be, but that James loved him as a son just as much. And then Papa said that if Mama had a son, then he had a son too, Grace finished triumphantly. She loved that part. That is right, James confirmed. He looked at Beatrice over the children's heads, and the love in his eyes was as strong as it had been the day they married. Best decision I ever made. Second best, Beatrice corrected gently. The first was deciding to stay in Georgetown instead of moving on. Fair point, James conceded. As the evening deepened, and the first stars appeared over the mountains, Beatrice looked at her family and felt a profound sense of gratitude. The road that had brought her here had been hard, marked by loss and struggle. But it had also been marked by love and resilience, and the quiet courage of moving forward. She thought about Michael sometimes, about the life they might have had if he had lived. But she no longer felt guilty about loving James or building this new life. Michael would have wanted her to be happy, would have wanted Thomas to have a father and siblings and a good home. She was honoring his memory by living fully, by loving deeply, by making sure their son grew up knowing he was cherished. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. Thomas grew into a fine young man and eventually married a school teacher from Denver. They settled on a ranch adjoining James and Beatrice's property, and Beatrice became a grandmother at 41, marveling at Thomas's gentle skill with his own son. Mikey surprised everyone by developing a passion for medicine. He apprenticed with the doctor in Georgetown and eventually went to medical school in Denver, returning to set up practice in his hometown. He married late, at 30, to a widow with 2 young children of her own. Grace became a teacher, like Thomas's wife, and taught at the school in Georgetown. She married one of Mikey's friends, a surveyor, and they had 4 children in quick succession, keeping Beatrice busy with grandmothering duties. James eventually retired from the Cattlemen's Association, though he continued to consult occasionally. He focused his energy on the ranch and on spending time with his growing brood of grandchildren. His hair went gray, and his face became more lined, but his eyes were still the same gray-green that had captured Beatrice's heart all those years ago. Beatrice's hair turned white, and her hands became gnarled with arthritis, but she remained active, tending her garden and cooking for the family gatherings that happened every Sunday. It was on one such Sunday, with the house full of children and grandchildren and the noise of happy chaos all around, that James pulled Beatrice aside. They walked out to the porch, away from the commotion, and stood looking at the mountains that had witnessed their entire life together. Happy? James asked, taking her hand. More than I ever dreamed possible, Beatrice said honestly. You gave me this, James, this beautiful, full life. I never thought I would have it after Michael died. I thought that part of my life was over. You gave me just as much. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose beyond just drifting from place to place. You made me want to be a better man. James raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. I have loved you for 40 years, Beatrice Northwood, and I will love you for 40 more if the Lord grants us the time." Beatrice leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him. They had built something remarkable together, something that would outlast them both. Their children were happy and settled. Their grandchildren were healthy and thriving. The ranch was prosperous, and their name was respected throughout the region. But more than any of that, they had loved each other well. Through hard times and good, through loss and joy, through the ordinary and the extraordinary moments that made up a life. That was the real achievement, the real legacy. Inside the house, Grace called out that dinner was ready. James and Beatrice made their way back inside, hand in hand, to the table surrounded by the family they had created together. As they bowed their heads for Grace, Beatrice felt overwhelmed with thankfulness. She had come to Georgetown afraid and alone, with nothing but a young son and desperate hope. She had found love when she least expected it, had built a life richer than she could have imagined. The cowboy who had said, "Then I have a son too now," had kept that promise and so many more. As the meal began and conversation flowed around them, Beatrice caught James's eye across the table. He smiled at her, that same smile that had made her heart flutter 40 years ago, and she smiled back. They had made it. Through everything, together, they had made it. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the size of the ranch or the amount of money in the bank or even the number of children and grandchildren, though all of those were blessings. What mattered was the love they had built together, the choice they had made every single day to keep choosing each other, to keep building, to keep believing in the promise of tomorrow. The mountains stood eternal outside their windows, and inside, their family laughed and ate and lived. Beatrice squeezed James's hand under the table, and he squeezed back, a silent conversation of love and gratitude and contentment. They had taken a chance on each other in that dusty boarding house yard so long ago. A widow with a child and a wandering cowboy with nothing but his horse and his gun. And from that unlikely beginning, they had created something beautiful and lasting. A home. A family. A love story written in the mountains and valleys of Colorado, as enduring as the land itself. As the evening wore on and the grandchildren began to get sleepy, families started to take their leave. Thomas and his wife gathered their brood, Mikey and his family headed back to town, and Grace's husband loaded their children into the wagon. The house grew quiet again, just James and Beatrice as it had been for so many evenings over the decades. They cleaned up together, moving through the familiar routine with the ease of long practice. When the last dish was dried and put away, they sat together on the porch one more time, watching the stars come out over the mountains. "You ever regret it?" Beatrice asked quietly. "Taking on a widow with a child. You could have had an easier life." James pulled her close. "Not for a single second. You were worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth everything. And Thomas, Mikey, Grace, all our grandchildren, this whole beautiful, complicated life we have built together. I would not trade any of it for all the gold in these mountains. I love you, James Northwood. I love you too, Beatrice. Always have, always will." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something that would echo through generations. The house behind them held decades of memories, every room marked with laughter and tears, triumphs and struggles, the rich tapestry of a life fully lived. In the barn, horses shifted and settled for the night. In the pasture, cattle lowed softly. And on the porch, two people who had taken a chance on love held each other close, grateful for every moment they had been given, every moment still to come. The story that had started with a frightened whisper and a bold promise had become a legacy, a testament to the power of love to heal and transform and endure. Beatrice had come to Georgetown running from grief, and she had found hope. She had come alone, and she had found family. She had come broken, and she had found wholeness. And James, the wandering cowboy who had never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, had found his home. Not in a place, but in a person, in a family, in the life they had built together stone by careful stone. As they finally rose to go inside for the night, James paused at the door and looked back at the mountains one more time. "Thank you," he said softly, whether to God or fate or the land itself. Beatrice was not sure, but she understood. She felt it too, that overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought them here, for every twist and turn that had seemed like disaster at the time, but had ultimately led them to each other. They went inside together, closed the door on the night, and climbed the stairs to the bedroom they had shared for 40 years. And in the quiet darkness, with James's arms around her and the sound of his heartbeat steady in her ear, Beatrice drifted off to sleep, content in the knowledge that she was loved, she was home, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. The story of the widow and the cowboy, which had begun with fear and uncertainty, had become a love story for the ages, proof that second chances were real, that love could bloom in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the best thing you could ever find was someone willing to say, "Then I have a son too now," and mean it with their whole heart.